At 8:15 on August 6th, 1945, General Kurechika Anami stood in the underground war room beneath Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters, staring at a communications board that showed something impossible. Japan's eighth largest city had vanished from every radio frequency, 340,000 people silenced in an instant. And the war minister, who had never known defeat, was about to learn that his own scientific expertise had become the weapon that would destroy his nation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of staff officers who hunched over maps showing Japan's shrinking empire. The air in the bunker was thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of fear. Though none of these men would admit to fear. They were samurai in modern uniforms, descendants of warriors who had served emperors for 1,000 years. And samurai did not feel fear, they felt duty. Anami was 58 years old, his face weathered by 4 years of total war, his uniform crisp despite the humid August morning. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who believed in Japan's divine destiny, who knew in his bones that the emperor was descended from gods and that Japan could not lose because the universe itself would not permit such an outcome. This wasn't blind faith. It was certainty built on generations of tradition, on victories that stretched back centuries, on a warrior code that made surrender worse than death. But this morning something was wrong, terribly wrong. And Anami could feel it in the silence that filled the communications room like poison gas. A young communications officer approached, his hands shaking despite his best efforts to maintain military bearing. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the polished floor. "Sir," he said, his voice barely steady, "we've lost all contact with Hiroshima, all military frequencies, all civilian radio." Everything went silent at approximately 8:15 this morning. The officer swallowed hard, waiting for his commander's response. Anami's dark eyes narrowed. He'd been a soldier for 40 years, had seen men die in every way war could devise, had ordered thousands to their deaths without hesitation. But in 4 years of total war, he'd never seen an entire city simply disappear from existence. Cities didn't vanish. Armies could be destroyed, fleets could be sunk, but cities of 340,000 people didn't stop transmitting all at once unless something catastrophic had occurred. Anami turned to the other 5 men who controlled Japan's fate. They called themselves the Supreme War Council, the Big Six, and they genuinely believed they held the keys to victory, even as American B-29 bombers turned Japanese cities to ash, night after night. The council included Admiral Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, a man whose strategic brilliance had earned him command of Japan's combined fleet, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Army Chief of Staff, whose face showed no emotion regardless of the news, Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, 77 years old and increasingly doubtful about Japan's chances, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, the only civilian among them, who had been arguing for peace negotiations for months, and Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, whose pragmatism was slowly winning converts among the military hardliners. 6 men, 70 million lives hanging in the balance. And they were about to make the worst decision of their lives based on expertise that would kill them. Here's what made them so dangerously confident. What made them dismiss the impossible thing that had just happened at Hiroshima. They knew secrets the Americans couldn't possibly understand. Since 1940, Japan had been racing to build its own atomic bomb. 2 separate programs running simultaneously. The Army's NI-GO project under Dr. Yoshio Nishina and the Navy's F-GO program under Dr. Bunsaku Arakatsu. These weren't amateur efforts led by second-rate scientists. Nishina was one of the world's leading nuclear physicists, a man who had worked with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, who had published groundbreaking papers on quantum mechanics, who understood the theoretical foundations of atomic fission better than almost anyone alive, and that knowledge had taught him something crucial. something that would doom his nation. Building atomic bombs was virtually impossible. The uranium enrichment alone required industrial facilities beyond imagination, massive electromagnetic separation plants consuming thousands of tons of uranium ore, electrical power consumption that would drain entire regions. Nishina had done the calculations himself, had verified them with the best minds in Japanese physics, and the conclusion was inescapable. Even the mighty United States, with its untouched industrial base and vast resources, could produce perhaps 1 or 2 atomic weapons at most, maybe 3 if they had started earlier than anyone suspected. But certainly not more. The physics simply wouldn't allow it. The engineering challenges were insurmountable, and this wasn't speculation or hope. This was hard science. Mathematical certainty, the kind of knowledge that could be trusted absolutely, because it was built on the fundamental laws of the universe. So when the first scattered reports began arriving from reconnaissance aircraft, when pilots radioed back descriptions that sounded like fever dreams, Anami and his colleagues dismissed them with the confidence of men who possessed superior knowledge. A small number of B-29 seconds attacked Hiroshima with a new type bomb. Read the first coherent report. Considerable damage observed, mushroom-shaped cloud rising to approximately 40,000 feet. Admiral Toyoda barely looked up from his strategic maps. He'd survived the massive B-29 raids that had already destroyed 42 major Japanese cities, had seen Tokyo burn in a firestorm that killed 100,000 people in a single night. Considerable damage from a few bombers, he said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much destruction. Probably a concentrated incendiary attack. The Americans are getting more efficient with their targeting. General Umezu nodded agreement, his face showing no emotion, as always. We've seen large explosions before, he said. Ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, sometimes a lucky hit can create dramatic effects. We should wait for confirmation before drawing conclusions. The other council members murmured agreement. They were men of reason, men of science. They would not panic based on preliminary reports from pilots who might have been confused or mistaken. But as August 6th wore into August 7th, as the hours passed without any communication from Hiroshima, as train schedules were indefinitely suspended and military couriers failed to arrive, and the reconnaissance flights brought back photographs that showed something unprecedented, the reports grew stranger, more disturbing, impossible to dismiss. One pilot reported that the entire city center had been flattened, not burned like in the incendiary raids, but flattened, as if a giant hand had pressed down on Hiroshima and crushed it into the earth. Another reported seeing the mushroom cloud from 200 miles away, a column of smoke and dust rising higher than any building, higher than mountains, punching through the clouds into the stratosphere. Most unsettling of all was the report from a weather reconnaissance plane that had been over Hiroshima shortly after the attack. The pilot's voice on the recording was shaking, barely controlled. "The city is gone," he said. "Not burning, not damaged. Gone. There's nothing left but a crater and rubble. I've never seen anything like this. Nothing in my training prepared me for this." Then came President Truman's radio announcement. Transmitted by shortwave and picked up by Japanese monitors, the American president's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were announcing a minor military victory rather than unveiling a weapon that changed everything. 16 hours ago, Truman said, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. The silence in the Supreme War Council meeting room was absolute. Anami could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the sound of paper rustling as an aide placed the transcript of Truman's speech on the table. Admiral Toyoda spoke first, his voice carrying the studied calm of a career military officer who had learned to control emotion. The Americans are engaged in psychological warfare, he said. Even if they have developed some form of atomic device, and I'm not convinced they have, the technical requirements make mass production impossible. Our own research confirms this, Doctor. Nishina has been quite clear on this point. The Americans might have built one such weapon, perhaps as a demonstration, but they cannot have an arsenal of them. The physics won't allow it. Anami nodded slowly. Toyoda's reasoning made sense, matched everything they knew about atomic weapons. If the Americans possessed multiple atomic bombs, Anami said, they would have used them months ago. They would have dropped them on Tokyo, on our military headquarters, on the Imperial Palace, if they truly wanted to break our will. This is clearly a desperate gambit. Their only such device used in a last attempt to frighten us into surrender before they're forced to invade the home islands. An invasion they know will cost them 1 million casualties. Foreign Minister Togo shifted uncomfortably. He'd been to America, had lived in the West, understood their industrial capacity in ways the military men did not. With respect, Togo said carefully, we should not dismiss the possibility that American industrial power has accomplished what we consider impossible. They have resources we cannot match, factories that haven't been bombed, electrical grids that function. Perhaps we should send investigators immediately to determine exactly what happened at Hiroshima before we make assumptions. Assumptions? Toyoda's voice carried an edge now. Foreign Minister, these are not assumptions. These are conclusions based on scientific fact, Doctor. Nishina is not some amateur. He trained with the finest physicists in Europe. He understands atomic theory as well as any man alive. And he has told us categorically that producing multiple atomic weapons is beyond even American capability. Are we now to doubt our own scientists in favor of American propaganda? The argument continued. Voices rising, tempers fraying. But underneath the debate lay a deeper truth. These men couldn't accept what had happened at Hiroshima because accepting it would mean accepting that everything they knew was wrong, that their expertise was worthless, that the rules of warfare had changed so fundamentally that their decades of military experience counted for nothing. And that was a truth more terrifying than any weapon. What they couldn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that their scientific expertise had become their greatest weakness. Their atomic research had taught them exactly how difficult the task was, how many obstacles stood in the way of building atomic weapons, but it had also blinded them to American industrial capabilities they couldn't fathom. The Manhattan Project had employed 130,000 workers across multiple states, had consumed more electricity than entire nations, had cost $2 billion, an amount so vast it exceeded Japan's entire military budget for the war. It represented the largest secret industrial undertaking in human history, a project that had recruited the finest scientific minds from across the world, that had built entire cities in the desert just to house the workers, that had solved engineering problems that Japanese scientists considered unsolvable simply by throwing unlimited resources at every obstacle. The Japanese military leaders were making decisions based on what they knew was possible, but they were fighting an enemy that had redefined possible itself. While Japanese scientists struggled with inadequate equipment and constant power shortages, American scientists worked in laboratories with unlimited funding, while Japanese engineers tried to build uranium separation facilities with machinery damaged by bombing raids. American engineers constructed purpose-built factories that covered square miles. The scale difference was so vast that it was literally unimaginable to men who had spent 4 years watching their industrial capacity slowly destroyed by American air raids. As August 7th turned into August 8th, as the first investigation teams began sending reports back from Hiroshima's ruins, reports that described devastation beyond anything seen in human history, the Supreme War Council met again. This time the reports were more detailed, more specific, and far more disturbing. Dr. Nishina himself was traveling to Hiroshima, would arrive sometime on August 8th. His preliminary reports via radio were terse, technical, frightening in their implications. Extensive blast damage, consistent with explosive yield in the kiloton range. One message read. Thermal effects visible at distances exceeding 3 kilometers. Preliminary radiation readings show levels far above natural background. Assessment ongoing. Will report findings upon return. Anami studied the reports in silence. He'd commanded men in battle, had seen the aftermath of conventional bombing raids, had walked through cities reduced to ash and rubble, but the descriptions coming from Hiroshima didn't match anything in his experience. Buildings vaporized rather than burned. Human shadows burned permanently into concrete. Victims suffering from an unknown illness that caused hair loss, vomiting, bleeding, death. What kind of weapon created such effects? What force could cause such destruction? General Umezu spoke what everyone was thinking. Even if the Americans have developed an atomic bomb, and the evidence suggests they cannot have many. Our scientists assure us of this. We should continue our preparations for Ketsugo. Ketsugo was Japan's final defense plan. The operation that would mobilize every man, woman, and child to resist the American invasion. It called for 10,000 aircraft to be used as kamikazes, for civilians to be armed with bamboo spears, for every beach to be fortified, every city to become a fortress. The plan assumed that Americans, faced with casualties in the millions, would negotiate rather than pay the price for total conquest. But Ketsugo assumed conventional warfare, assumed that American forces would have to fight their way across Japan city by city, block by block. What did Ketsugo mean if America could simply erase Japanese cities from existence without ever landing a single soldier? Foreign Minister Togo stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger, "we are discussing military strategy as if Hiroshima were a minor setback. A single city has been destroyed by a single bomb. Over 100,000 people are dead or dying. And we sit here debating whether the Americans can do it again. What if they can? What if they have 10 such bombs? 20? What if they drop one on Tokyo tomorrow? What do we tell the Emperor then? That our scientists assured us it was impossible?" The room fell silent. No one wanted to answer that question. Anami finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Foreign Minister, I understand your concern, but we must not allow fear to drive our decisions. Yes, Hiroshima was a tragedy. Yes, this new weapon is devastating, but we cannot surrender based on one attack. We must wait for Dr. Nishina's complete report, must understand exactly what we're facing before we make any decision about Japan's future. The Emperor's subjects deserve nothing less than complete information before we consider the unthinkable." Togo sat down slowly, defeated. He knew he was outvoted, knew that the military men would cling to their certainty until reality forced them to let go. But how much would that reality cost? How many more cities would burn? How many more civilians would die, while these generals waited for their scientists to confirm what was already obvious? Hiroshima was gone. Over 100,000 people had died in an instant, and the Americans had done it with a single airplane carrying a single bomb. Nothing else mattered. No scientific theory, no expert opinion, no military doctrine could change that fundamental fact. Dr. Yoshio Nishina had seen the theoretical calculations, had worked through the mathematics of nuclear fission 1,000 times, understood better than almost any human being alive what an atomic bomb could do in theory. But theory and reality are separated by a chasm that can only be crossed through direct experience. And on August 7th, 1945, Nishina crossed that chasm and found himself in hell. The train journey from Tokyo toward Hiroshima took 11 hours, through a landscape that seemed increasingly surreal. For the first 200 kilometers, everything looked normal. farmland, villages, the ordinary landscape of wartime Japan. But as the train approached the Hiroshima region, subtle changes became visible. Trees stripped of leaves on one side, telephone poles leaning at odd angles, a strange haze hanging in the air that caught the sunlight in peculiar ways. Then, about 30 kilometers from the city, the train stopped. The tracks ahead had been twisted into impossible spirals by forces that defied comprehension. Massive steel rails bent like wire. Concrete ties cracked and displaced. Nishina and his team would have to walk the rest of the way. The first bodies appeared 5 kilometers from the city center. People who had been far enough from the blast to survive initially, but not far enough to escape the radiation. They lay by the roadside, some still moving weakly, others already dead, their skin covered in purple blotches, blood seeping from their eyes and mouths. Nishina had brought medical supplies, but there was nothing in his kit that could treat what he was seeing. This wasn't burns or shrapnel wounds. This was something new, something that attacked the human body at the cellular level, something that killed slowly and inevitably. Then Nishina walked into what had been Hiroshima, and nothing, absolutely nothing in his education or experience had prepared him for what he found. The city hadn't been destroyed. It had been erased. For a radius of 2 kilometers from the hypocenter, every building had been reduced to rubble. Not burned or collapsed, but pulverized, as if struck by a hammer the size of a city. The few structures that remained standing were skeletal frames of reinforced concrete, their walls blown away, their interiors gutted. Everything else was simply gone, reduced to dust and debris that covered the ground in a gray layer like volcanic ash. But it was the shadows that haunted Nishina for the rest of his life. Human shadows burned permanently into concrete and stone, the ghostly outlines of people who had been walking to work or waiting at tram stops when 8:15 became the last moment they would ever experience. One shadow showed a man pulling a cart. His outline burned into the wall behind him with such clarity that Nishina could see the hat on his head. Another showed a woman sitting on steps, her kimono's pattern visible in the thermal burns. These weren't bodies, weren't remains. They were negative images, permanent photographs created by thermal radiation so intense it had burned human shapes into stone before vaporizing the humans themselves. Nishina's hands trembled as he assembled his Geiger counter, a device he'd built himself in his laboratory. He'd brought it to measure radiation levels, to confirm what he suspected. The clicking started immediately, a slow staccato that increased as he moved toward the hypocenter. By the time he reached ground zero, the point directly below where the bomb had detonated, the counter was clicking so fast it became a continuous scream. The radiation levels were lethal. Anyone standing here would absorb a fatal dose in minutes. And yet people were still here, survivors stumbling through the ruins, searching for family members, for food, for water, absorbing radiation with every breath, every footstep, dying without knowing they were already dead. The hypocenter itself was marked by the skeletal remains of the Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, the only building at Ground Zero that hadn't completely collapsed. Its dome structure had somehow survived, standing like a gravestone over the 100,000 dead. Nishina stood beneath it, his Geiger counter screaming, and did the calculations in his head. The bomb had detonated approximately 600 meters above this spot. The blast wave had traveled downward and outward at supersonic speed, creating pressures that exceeded anything in conventional warfare. The thermal radiation had been so intense that it had heated the air itself to temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. For a fraction of a second, Hiroshima had contained a miniature star. But it was the radiation sickness that confirmed Nishina's worst fears. This wasn't just an explosive device, wasn't just a very large conventional bomb. This was the fundamental forces of the universe unleashed on a human city. The victims he'd seen weren't suffering from burns or blast injuries. They were experiencing acute radiation syndrome, Their bodies' cells were dying faster than they could regenerate. Their bone marrow was being destroyed. Their immune systems were collapsing. They were being killed by gamma rays and neutrons, by invisible particles that passed through flesh and bone as if they weren't there, by the same atomic forces that powered the sun. Nishina took soil samples, measured blast patterns, documented everything with the methodical precision of a scientist, even as his heart broke with every new discovery. By evening on August 7th, he had enough data to write his preliminary report. He found a functioning telegraph office 20 kilometers from the city and sent a message to Tokyo. Short, technical, devastating. Confirmed atomic detonation. Estimated yield 15 to 20 kilotons. Extensive thermal and radiation effects. Casualties estimated 100,000 plus. City effectively destroyed. Weapon far exceeds theoretical projections. American industrial capability severely underestimated. Recommend immediate policy review. That night, Nishina sat in a commandeered office and wrote a longer report, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. He described the physics of what he'd seen, explained how the Americans had overcome obstacles Japanese scientists had considered insurmountable, detailed the effects of radiation poisoning. But underneath the technical language was a message of absolute despair. Everything he'd told the military leaders was wrong. The Americans hadn't built one atomic bomb. They'd built a weapon so sophisticated, so well-engineered, that it worked exactly as designed, which meant they could build more, could build many more, could potentially build hundreds. Japan's atomic program had failed, not because the science was wrong, but because Japanese industry couldn't support it, couldn't provide the resources, the electrical power, the precision machinery, the thousands of specialized workers. But American industry had done all of that and more, had accomplished the impossible through sheer scale and determination. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Supreme War Council was receiving Nishina's preliminary report with reactions ranging from shock to denial. Admiral Toyoda read it twice, then crumpled the paper in his fist. "This is one bomb," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "One bomb dropped on one city. Tragic, devastating, but still just one bomb. The Americans cannot have many of these weapons. The industrial requirements are too vast. Even Nishina's report confirms that. He says, we underestimated American capability. Fine. We accept that. But there are limits to what even American industry can produce. We should assume they have perhaps 3 to 5 such weapons, which means we can still pursue Ketsugo, can still make invasion too costly for them to contemplate." General Anami nodded slowly. Toyoda's analysis made strategic sense. Even with atomic bombs, the Americans would face enormous challenges invading Japan. They'd need to land forces, establish beachheads, fight through the home islands, and every step would cost them casualties. "I propose," Anami said, "that we continue our defensive preparations while also reaching out through diplomatic channels to explore possible terms for a conditional surrender. We don't accept unconditional surrender. That remains unthinkable, but perhaps we can negotiate terms that preserve the emperor's position and allow Japan to maintain some sovereignty." Foreign Minister Togo leaned forward, finally hearing something approaching reason. "What terms would we propose?" he asked. Anami ticked them off on his fingers. "First, the emperor's position must be guaranteed. Second, Japan will handle its own war crimes trials. Third, no occupation of the home islands. Fourth, Japan oversees its own disarmament. These are our minimum conditions, non-negotiable. If the Americans accept, we'll consider surrender. If not, we fight to the death." Togo closed his eyes. These terms were absurd. The Americans had spent 4 years in untold blood destroying Japan's military, had just demonstrated a weapon that could erase cities. Why would they negotiate now? Why would they accept anything less than unconditional surrender? But at least it was movement. At least the council was finally discussing surrender rather than simply preparing for glorious extinction. "I will transmit these terms through our embassy in Switzerland," Togo said. "But I must tell you honestly, I do not believe the Americans will accept them. They have demanded unconditional surrender since 1943. They have never wavered from that position. And now that they possess atomic weapons, they have less reason than ever to negotiate." The meeting adjourned at midnight on August 8th. The council members dispersed to their homes and offices, exhausted, frightened, clinging to the hope that perhaps the worst was over, that perhaps Hiroshima was the only atomic bomb, that perhaps they could still find an honorable way out of this war. They had no idea that in 9 hours everything would change again, that their entire world was about to collapse for the second time in 3 days. At 11:02 on August 9th, 1945, as the Supreme War Council was finally reconvening to discuss Dr. Nishina's full report on Hiroshima, as they were finally beginning to accept the reality of what had happened, an aide burst into the conference room with a message that drained the color from every face present. "Nagasaki has been attacked," the aide said, his voice breaking. "Another atomic bomb. The city is destroyed. Preliminary reports indicate damage similar to Hiroshima. Communications are severed. Casualty estimates are not yet available but appear catastrophic." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Admiral Toyoda's pen clattering to the mahogany table. He stared at the messenger as if the man had spoken in a foreign language. "Another bomb," Toyoda whispered. "It's been only 3 days. 3 days. How is this possible? How can they have another bomb already?" General Umezu's face showed emotion for the first time. Raw shock, replacing his usual stoic mask. "This changes everything," he said. "If they have 2 bombs, they could have 10, could have 50. Our entire strategic calculation was wrong. We assume scarcity, assume the Americans would use atomic weapons sparingly, if at all. But if they can drop them every few days, if they can simply erase our cities, one by one, until nothing remains." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Anami stood slowly, his movements those of a man who had aged years in seconds. He walked to the wall map of Japan, studied the red pins marking cities destroyed by conventional bombing, added 2 more pins for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then spoke in a voice that carried an eerie poetry. "Would it not be wondrous," he said, "for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower, to die together rather than submit to the shame of conquest? There is something pure in that, something aesthetically perfect. The entire Japanese people going into the darkness as one, honorably, maintaining our dignity even in death." The other council members stared at him in stunned silence. Foreign Minister Togo found his voice first. "General Anami," he said, his words measured, controlled. "You are proposing national suicide. You are suggesting that 70 million people should die rather than accept surrender. Do you understand what you're saying? Do you comprehend the magnitude of that choice?" Anami turned from the map, his face serene. "I understand perfectly, Foreign Minister. I am saying that honor matters more than survival, that how we die matters more than whether we live. Our ancestors would understand, would approve. They would rather see Japan disappear from history than see it bow before foreign masters. And I feel the same. Death with honor is preferable to life with shame." The argument that followed was bitter, fierce, voices rising to shouts that could be heard through the bunker's thick walls. Anami and Toyoda arguing for continued resistance even against atomic annihilation. Togo and Yonai arguing for immediate surrender before more cities were destroyed. Suzuki and Umezu wavering between the 2 positions, trying to find middle ground where none existed. The debate continued for hours, through the afternoon and into the evening. while radiation victims in Nagasaki screamed and died, while fires burned in two obliterated cities, while the clock ticked toward midnight and potential oblivion. Then, at 23:30 on August 9th, came the intelligence report that would finally shatter the deadlock. A captured American fighter pilot, shot down 2 days after the Hiroshima bombing, had been interrogated. His name was Marcus McDilda. He was a conventional fighter pilot who had never been briefed on atomic weapons, knew absolutely nothing about the Manhattan Project. But faced with torture and desperate to survive, he had told his interrogators what he thought they wanted to hear, had embellished every detail he could imagine, and his desperate lies were about to end World War II. The interrogation report reached the Supreme War Council at midnight. Anami read it aloud, his voice hollow. The prisoner states that the Americans have over 100 atomic bombs stockpiled, that they can drop 3 per day, that the next targets are Tokyo, followed by Kyoto, then Osaka, that every major Japanese city will be destroyed within a month. The prisoner provided technical details about the bomb's construction and delivery method that appear credible. None of it was true. In reality, the United States had exactly 0 atomic bombs remaining after Nagasaki. The next weapon wouldn't be ready until late August. Production was painfully slow, but McDilda's fabricated intelligence contained just enough technical-sounding detail to be believable to interrogators, who were grasping for any information about this incomprehensible new weapon, and it landed on the Supreme War Council like a final, crushing blow. General Umezu spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. If the Americans can drop 3 atomic bombs per day, Japan will cease to exist within 2 weeks. Every city destroyed, every military installation obliterated, the population either dead or dying from radiation. There would be nothing left to defend, nothing left to surrender. Just radioactive wasteland where our nation used to be. Admiral Toyoda nodded slowly. The man who had been so certain that Americans couldn't have many atomic bombs now faced the reality that they might have over 100. "We have no defense against this weapon," he said. "We cannot shoot down every American bomber, cannot prevent them from destroying our cities, cannot protect our people. Our strategy assumed conventional warfare, assumed that American casualties would mount during the invasion. But there will be no invasion. They'll just burn us all from the sky." Anami sat down heavily, his hands spread flat on the table. The man who had spoken so poetically about national extinction now confronted with the actual mechanics of it. 3 atomic bombs per day, 100 bombs total. Every city in Japan reduced to ash and shadows and radiation. The entire Japanese people not dying honorably in battle, but vaporized or slowly poisoned. Their deaths spread across weeks of agony. That wasn't beautiful, wasn't pure. It was simply extinction. And even Anami's warrior code couldn't find honor in it. Still, incredibly, the council remained deadlocked. 3 votes for surrender. Togo, Yonai, and Suzuki arguing that Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms immediately before more bombs fell. 3 votes against Anami, Toyoda, and Umezu arguing that surrender without conditions was unthinkable, that Japan must negotiate terms that preserve the emperor's position at minimum, that honor demanded they continue fighting, even if it meant national extinction. 6 men unable to agree, unable to move forward, unable to save their nation because they couldn't abandon the code that had defined them. It would take an intervention unprecedented in Japanese history to break the stalemate, something that hadn't occurred in over 1,000 years of imperial rule, something so extraordinary that it would shock the nation more than the atomic bombs themselves. Just before midnight, on August 9th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito did something no emperor had done in recorded history. He personally broke a government deadlock by speaking his own opinion, by making an executive decision rather than simply approving the consensus of his advisors. The scene was surreal, unprecedented, almost sacred in its strangeness. The 6 members of the Supreme War Council, along with Baron Kiichiro Hiranuma, knelt in formal positions around a polished table in an underground conference room. The Emperor, small in stature, but carrying the weight of divine authority, entered the room, and everyone's breath caught. Emperors didn't attend these meetings, didn't involve themselves in the messy mechanics of government. They reigned, but did not rule. Yet here was Hirohito, dressed in his army uniform, his face showing the strain of sleepless nights, preparing to do what no emperor had done, to personally decide Japan's fate. Hirohito spoke in the formal court Japanese that few people in modern Japan understood. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but every word carried absolute authority. "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad," he said, "and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and a prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. Ending the war is the only way to restore world peace and to relieve the nation from the terrible distress with which it is burdened." He paused, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes sweeping across the kneeling men before him. "I have studied the terms of the Allied reply to our note concerning the Potsdam Proclamation," he continued, "and I have concluded that it virtually acknowledges the position we have maintained, that it offers assurances that the Imperial House will continue. I cannot help feeling sad when I think of the people who have served me so faithfully, the soldiers and sailors who have been killed or wounded in battle, the families who have lost everything in the air raids. But the time has come when we must bear the unbearable, when we must suffer what is insufferable. I swallow my tears and give my sanction to the acceptance of the Allied proclamation." The silence that followed was absolute. Prime Minister Suzuki finally spoke, his voice shaking. "Your Majesty's decision shall be the decision of this government." Then Suzuki, who had survived an assassination attempt in 1936, who had served emperors for 50 years, broke down and wept openly, not from shame or defeat, but from relief that the nightmare was finally ending. Not everyone accepted the emperor's decision with relief. General Anami listened to Hirohito's words with his face rigid, showing nothing, but inside he was breaking. Everything he believed in, everything he'd built his life around, was collapsing. The emperor had decided to surrender, which meant Anami had to support that decision, had to help implement it, but doing so would violate everything his warrior code demanded. How could he serve an emperor who chose survival over honor? How could he face his subordinates who expected him to fight to the death? How could he live with himself, knowing he'd failed to protect Japan's divine destiny? On August 15th, 1945, as Japan prepared to hear the emperor's surrender announcement broadcast across the nation, as millions of Japanese people prepared to hear their god's voice for the first time, General Anami prepared to die. He'd spent the previous week helping draft the surrender documents, ensuring the emperor's safety, preventing military coup attempts by younger officers who refused to accept defeat. He'd done his duty to the end, but now his duty was complete and there was only one honorable path remaining. At 4 on August 15th, in his home, dressed in his army uniform, Anami wrote his final poem in brush and ink. The characters were carefully formed, despite his emotional state. "Having received great favors from His Majesty, I have nothing to say in the hour of my death." He wrote his name, then added a postscript. "I humbly apologize to the Emperor for the great crime. The crime he meant was losing the war, failing to protect Japan, allowing his nation to suffer the shame of surrender." Then he performed seppuku, ritual suicide. The act was methodical, precise, exactly as tradition demanded. He cut his abdomen with a tanto dagger, the pain excruciating, then cut his throat to ensure death would be quick. He died as he had lived, according to the warrior code that atomic weapons had rendered obsolete. His final act was to refuse to see the new world that was being born, to die in the old world where honor mattered more than survival, where death was preferable to dishonor, where warriors chose extinction over adaptation. But perhaps the most tragic figure was Admiral Toyoda, who had so confidently declared that Americans couldn't have many atomic bombs, who had assured the Council that Japanese scientific expertise gave them superior knowledge, who had been so catastrophically wrong after the war, when the full scope of the Manhattan Project was revealed. When journalists described the massive facilities at Oak Ridge and Hanford, when photographs showed the industrial scale that had produced the bombs, Toyota reportedly spent days in his home, alone, staring at the technical reports, unable to speak. He'd been certain that American industrial capacity couldn't match the task, certain that physics itself prevented mass production of atomic weapons, and he'd been wrong about everything. His expertise had killed his nation. Years later, in his memoirs, Toyota wrote about August 1945 with a clinical detachment that barely concealed his anguish. "We made decisions based on the best information available to us," he wrote. "Our scientists, the finest minds in Japan, told us that atomic bombs were theoretically possible, but practically impossible to mass produce. We believed them because they were experts, because their knowledge was built on sound physics. Because we trusted the scientific method, we did not account for the possibility that American industrial capacity could overcome obstacles we considered insurmountable. That was our failure. Not a failure of knowledge, but a failure of imagination." The atomic bombings didn't just end World War II. They marked the end of an entire military philosophy built on honor, sacrifice, and conventional warfare. They proved that technology could render courage obsolete, that industrial capacity could overcome any defensive strategy, that the rules of warfare could change so fundamentally that decades of military expertise became worthless in an instant. Modern military planners study August 1945 not just as history but as a warning about the dangers of cognitive blindness in leadership, about how expertise can become a prison, about how professional knowledge can prevent leaders from recognizing revolutionary changes until it's too late. The Japanese military leadership in August 1945 made every decision that their training, experience, and knowledge told them was correct. They consulted experts, analyzed intelligence, followed established doctrine, did everything right according to their worldview. And they were wrong about everything because their worldview itself was obsolete. They couldn't believe in the atomic bomb's devastating power because they had convinced themselves through rigorous scientific analysis that it was impossible. Their knowledge became a weapon used against them. Their expertise blinded them to reality, until reality forced them to see it in mushroom clouds and burning cities. Today, as we face our own technological revolutions, as artificial intelligence and quantum computing and biotechnology promise to change warfare as fundamentally as atomic weapons did in 1945, the story of Japan's Supreme War Council remains painfully relevant. It reminds us that the greatest military disasters often come not from external enemies, but from internal inability to adapt to new realities. That certainty is the enemy of wisdom. That expertise without humility leads to catastrophe. The Japanese military couldn't believe in what they hadn't seen, couldn't adapt to what they couldn't imagine, and that failure cost them everything: their cities, their empire, their illusions of invincibility, and for some, like General Anami, their lives. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the certainty that you understand the rules of the game, even when someone else has already changed them forever. The real tragedy of August 1945 wasn't that Japan lost the war. They'd already lost. The tragedy was that their leaders' inability to accept new realities led to 2 atomic bombings, to over 200,000 deaths, to suffering that could have been prevented if these 6 men had been able to look beyond their expertise and their honor code to see the world as it actually was, rather than as they believed it must be. If you want more stories like this, hit the like button, subscribe for the next forgotten chapter of history,